There can't only be three of us, so we're all in the wrong meeting. Huh. Dylan, you can't connect either? Teresa, good to meet you, but we're trying to get to the other meeting, right? I can't hear anything.
Hi, and I can't either, and I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I've tried writing back to Ben, who sent the message, and uh, I think you, Dylan, and myself are all, we're trying to get into that seminar, but we got the wrong link. So I don't know what to do.
Huh.
I think we have to leave. Clearly this, this is wrong. So we have to shut this down and try to get in some other way, but
It
I don't
may
know.
not start until 11:30 is what I'm thinking. I'm gonna go back
Oh,
and
I thought
look.
it started at 11.
Well,
Oh,
it's 11:30. Yep, it's 11:30.
11:30. Well, that will explain.
Yes, so we're early, I believe. So I'm
I'm
gonna
not
log
always
back off.
I'm not always this on time. Usually I'm the day before. Sometimes
Well,
I'm the day before.
yeah, it said join meeting in progress, which is why I went ahead and logged on.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but I'll log back in at 11:30.
yeah, me too. Okay, we have to stop meeting like this. All right, take care. Nice
Thank
to meet
you.
you. Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Jolene. Nice to see you.
How are you today?
Good.
Good to see you.
Sitting
How did
over.
everything go
What
with
was that?
your, I said, did everything go well with your move?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm coming to you now from from the new house.
Oh,
Very
good.
excited.
So am I co-host yet?
You are now. Yes.
Okay. Could we bring up Julie's poster? Do you have that handy, or do you want me to do that?
I've got it. I can do that.
Okay, let's put the poster up.
Mhm. Second, while I find it. There it is.
Yeah, great. Ben, will it be easier, Ben, for us to just have a discussion about what we've learned from promoting this event soon?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe even after this.
I think I wouldn't be able to do it after this because I go right into my next class.
Oh,
But we could, let's get something on the calendar, okay?
sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Julie's writing that she's got a European conference and she just finished, she got the times wrong and she had to cut it short. She needs to grab a water. Okay, so we'll just wait a minute before she's gonna join us. I know these time things are difficult. Okay. Give it a minute. Good morning, everyone. This is Jolene Rickard from the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. I would like to welcome you to our bi-weekly speaker series, and we're very lucky this afternoon to welcome Julie Watson to the discussion, conceptually zooming in from Europe. It's just at this kind of time of, crossing the world in different ways. She's a designer, activist, academic, and author of Low Tech, an amazing new book that when it hit the stands, it was sold out almost immediately. The notion of design by radical indigenism. She's born in Australia, but based in New York. She's a leading expert in the field of low-tech nature-based technologies for the built environment and climate resilient design. She teaches urban design at the she teaches urban design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She is also dedicated to donating a percentage of the profits from this text to support Indigenous communities in low-tech design by radical indigenism, specifically the living bridge that's on the cover of the text. I'm going to have to get a correction on the pronunciation of this in the Pioneersa in the East Khalsi Hills of India. Mm-hmm. The Nature Iraq organization working with the Madai of the southern wetlands of Iraq, and Give a Little Iku Dean Foundation in the eastern Kolkata wetlands of India, and Bees working with the Tofino fishermen of Benin. And so, all over the world supporting just different indigenous projects and rewilding and reclamation sites. And so she also has a studio practice, and as well as her academic work. And she works she approaches design through an anthropological and ecological lens. And with that, we'd like to welcome Julie this afternoon to our speaker series as we look forward to the future of the intersection between Indigenous thought and our relationship to what in Indigenous studies some people refer to as place-based knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jolene. It's lovely to see you again.
Yes.
And hi to everybody else. I'm going to share my screen now. I've got a presentation to give along with the discussion. And here we go. Okay, so I'm thinking you can see the title slide. Oh, great. Thank you, guys. Okay. So this is some work that it's really closely aligned with the book, but it's actually a lot of new work. So it's to be published in a book that's coming out at the end of the year, but mostly this is looking specifically at intertidal and underwater technologies, and it's also offering a comparison to some of the really most contemporary conversations that are happening around right now about the impact of sea level rise and climate change, but also some of the global frameworks that we're talking about, the technologies that we're looking at within that don't really account for nature-based technologies at this moment. So to begin with, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm actually physically talking to you from the land of the first people of Brooklyn, New York, the Lenape people, both past and present. And I want to acknowledge and honor with gratitude both the land and the Lenape people. And to talk about, coastlines and sea level rise. So we have been occupied. Coastlines have been occupied since, the earliest times of settlement, and they give access to trade and to resources. However, this proximity to coastlines sort of now is seen to pose a threat, as climate change is really forcing us to rethink our relationship with water. And as the seas rise, we must adapt. And so currently about 11% of the world's global population, they live in coastal areas, which are less than 10 meters above sea level. And after we've seen unprecedented disasters, the fear of flooding really has motivated responses to climate resilience. And this method that's preferred is this idea of fortification rather than accommodation or elevation or migration in response to shifting climates. And so overwhelmingly, also, there's a homogeneous high-tech infrastructures that are deployed irrespective both of local communities and environments in response to these different types of conditions. And these infrastructures, they're designed primarily by and for affluent cities. They have a single purpose solution, and they're adopted globally as these best practices, which are counterintuitively incompatible usually to often local skill sets and to ecosystems. And so this research really is trying to challenge this idea of the best practice narrative by documenting local responses to coastal resilience that instead actually amplify culture, ecology, economics, and agricultural resilience. And so the impacts of climate change to coastal communities, including sea level rise, storm surges, and salination will they will actually uniquely, not universally affect ecosystems and ecosystem services and natural and human systems as well. And that's really important to understand, because the solutions that we offer, we're looking at a universal approach rather than a unique approach. So avoiding catastrophe is really going to largely depend upon individual responses by communities and by local governments. And so, as stated in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate that came out last year, before technical limits are reached, economic and social limits will be reached, because societies are neither economically able nor socially willing to invest in coastal protection. And climate change is predominantly addressed in the aftermath of an environmental disaster through recovery and resilience efforts by government agencies. And in the times of crisis, when we're starting to think about adopting technologies, they become really market driven, and it becomes a quick solution that is required. And so in major cities like New York and Amsterdam, hard infrastructures and technical solutions to coastal resilience are deployed. But for less affluent cities, resilient technologies, they have to take a different approach to this. And so communities across the globe, they're still sold this belief that the high-tech solutions of developed cities are superior to their own innovations. And even though the former actually embody the intelligence of the environments and the cultures that evolve them. And so this research explores why hybridizing and scaling indigenous coastal nature-based technologies, and by hybridizing, we're talking about using multiple different types of local technologies and interventions, is both a more effective and more pragmatic solution for resilient design. It examines how local systems evolved from traditional ecological knowledge work as these multi-dimensional ecosystem approaches to reducing the impact of climate change. And so for low tech, this is the book, if you're not familiar, even though Jolene showed the front cover. It's really, low tech is an abbreviation of local and TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge. And it aims to bring these innovations to the attention of the emerging field of climate mitigating design. And low-tech, underwater and intertidal nature-based technologies, which is the focus of this lecture, is a deeper investigation into that specific topic, and it's cross-referenced with critical conversations from the Dutch, who have led this charge combating the advance of coastal waters, and from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2019 report, which I referenced before. And so this research, it really tells an ancient mythology, and that is just that humankind can and must live symbiotically with nature. And low tech is how communities have been dealing with extremes being faced for a millennia, for a really, really long time, by harnessing the energy and intelligence of complex ecosystems. And it suggests that it's eminently possible to weave local technologies symbiotically with natural systems into how the landscapes of the future are shaped. And landscapes, you know, they can be active and they can be adapted, and using local ecological solutions for sanitation, for storm surge, for sea level rise, for drought, deluge, wildfire, food supply and food security, as well as water security and fresh drinking water. And so this idea about the book, and especially the name, it was composed as a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek challenge and poking fun at this idea that often these solutions are talked about as low tech, LOWTECH, and that actually means unsophisticated, uncomplicated, and primitive. And this is an example of a low tech technology, which is called the Hippo roller, which was a means by which to transport water across large distances, fresh drinking water. And low tech is one of multiple abbreviations of this idea of low technology, and it means predating the Industrial Revolution. I would say instead low tech, TEK, aligns very synonymously with today's understanding and values of sustainability. Low energy, low embodied energy, low impact, low cost, while producing locally complex, nature-based innovations that are inherently and systemically sustainable. So forming the foundation of local technologies is TEK, and that is traditional ecological knowledge. And that's a field of anthropology. It's defined in the field of anthropology, sorry, I should say, as the cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief that's handed down. And by using TEK, communities have harnessed the energy of ecosystems and have adapted to environmental obstacles using soft, symbiotic, and living systems. And these are developed through direct contact with nature. And TEK is about being symbiotic and sustainable rather than erasing and exploiting resources. And it fosters symbiosis between species, both human species and non-human species, while making biodiversity almost like this building block for infrastructure and technology. And biodiversity is used actually to construct these technologies, which is a really different way of thinking about, in a parallel divergence to how we think of how often technology is thought about. And so many actually of the sort of green technologies for the built environment, I shouldn't say many, few, there are some technologies that we use in the built environment that are, you know, from the green roofs of Nordic countries to floating wetlands that used to be found all across the world. They have been around for thousands of years. And low tech actually highlights hundreds of nature-based technologies and local design innovations to pose this possible framework to adapt our understanding of what environmental innovation is. We accept that there are green roof systems. We see them as a current form of technology. We don't often understand the lineage from which these systems evolved. Low tech centers Indigenous communities and local technologies at the core of the climate change conversation, while attempting to reroute this sort of idea of a dominant relationship that is about superiority to this idea of symbiosis. And that is a discussion that is not started by myself. It's actually started by a scientist, Lynn Margolis, who talks about this idea of survival of the fittest actually not being relevant to us right now, but it's about survival of the most symbiotic. And so this research, you know, it continues lots of conversations in the built environment profession. It continues a conversation about vernacular architecture that was really highlighted most prominently in the design field by this particular exhibition you see an image of. It's called Architecture Without Architects, and it was an exhibition by Bernard Rudofsky. It was at MoMA in New York in 1967. And low-tech, however, explores the idea of, which this exhibition didn't, this idea of design and radical indigenism. And the concept of radical indigenism, that is a concept that was actually coined by Princeton PhD Eva Marie Garut, who also identifies as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And Professor Garut, she argues for a rebuilding of knowledge and exploration of Indigenous philosophies that are capable of generating new knowledge for Indigenous communities. And so really looking at the idea of climate change and climate adaptation and technologies, I had read the work of Professor Garut and thought, is this possible that we could consider the idea of radical indigenism in the realm of the built environment? And would that's what the low tech is responding to, really understanding the foundation of Professor Garut and saying, well, how would this be, if we looked at this in the context of the built environment, how would that be understood? So low tech, it orients us towards a different mythology of technology that's found across the globe. And it's a compendium of over 100 different technologies. And they sort of explore this idea of people and place and practice at the material, at the module, at the system, and the structural scale. So the scale of which architecture actually is manifested. And low tech is really trying to expand the definition of contemporary technology. And it tries to rebuild our understanding of climate resilient design that's really informed by different practices that we can see and local technologies that are sustainable, adaptable, and born out of necessity. And so moving on to this idea, the core foundation of what is the biggest adaptation? Sea level rise. It is accelerating, and it's promoting designers and scientists and economists and politicians all around the world to ask, how are we going to survive? And what are some of the solutions for sea level rise in this really continually shrinking time frame? And so, as mentioned before, the Netherlands, they're sort of leading, so they're seen as the nation that is the leading expert in combating sea level rise and dealing with sea level rise and really keeping the sea at bay. But universally, what works for the Netherlands, it is taken as best practice and as the benchmark for application by a lot of different countries all over the globe. But in reality, this is only true in very specific geopolitical locations that this would be successful. There are different cultures across the globe who have formed vastly varied relationships to water that are not synonymous with the Dutch approach, yet we're still applying the Dutch approach universally around the globe. So nor do these different cultures and communities have the vast resources to replicate some of the proposed solutions where local conditions, and we often have, there are local conditions that can mitigate some of these requirements for technologies. So I also want to talk about this briefly. This is a essay that everybody I think should read. It's really incredible, this idea of the collapse of the Western civilization. It was written by American science historian Naomi Oreskes. She's at Harvard University and also in a company with Eric Conway. And it really outlines this dystopian, but from a very scientific perspective that's really painfully plausible about the consequences of climate change upon humanity after we've actually failed. So it's like a futuristic essay after we've failed to curb global warming. And it focuses on Europe, it focuses on the Dutch, which is very interesting as well. And in this essay, this sort of dystopic future history is imagined, and the Netherlands is this main character of this history, where you see the whole Dutch population beginning to migrate northwards into Germany because of sea level rise and climate change. And, the essay, these are some maps from the essay. This shows on the left where we are now, and this shows like the changing conditions in the future with sea level rise, how the Netherlands would adapt. And it is dystopic, this future that is proposed. But it's talking about unforeseen environmental, this catastrophe but instead of saying that the Netherlands needs to respond in these drastic ways now, what it's saying that's really different to a lot of the conversations is that we'll have a gradual development and an evolution over time of how we would respond to climate change, rather than sort of these forced response to an understanding of major disasters. And it kind of talks about this alternative approach where when faced with this sort of deep uncertainty about climate change, you actually have an approach of wait and see that's very adaptable until the uncertainties are reduced. And so this is actually a much larger conversation sort of in climate change about adaptation to climate change. There are protocols around decision making in the face of this great uncertainty, especially in this era of climate change. And those protocols are beginning to shift based upon understandings about climate change. And so there's also a scientist that's doing some really interesting work. Her name is Marielle Haudenosaunee. She's an environmental scientist, and she's supporting this shift about this, rather than responding just to major disasters, this adaptation response to wait and see. And so she talks about this idea of adaptation pathways in which you have sequences of linked actions that are implemented as conditions actually begin to change. And these adaptation pathways, they are listed here. There are 4 distinct types of adaptation pathways: defend, surrender, offend, and retreat. And then, so the Dutch is having this conversation. When you start to look at the United Nations and the conversation they're having, they're identifying really similar types of approaches: protect, accommodate, advance, and retreat. And then they have this 5th approach, which is a multi-ecosystem approach. And so these alternative scenarios described as adaptation pathways, they start to actually expand our conversation on climate change beyond just simply fighting back, which is the major conversation that we're talking about now. So this is one step in a direction towards like offering an idea of different solutions and responses to climate change. So in the research that I'm doing, all of this I was building up to give you some context behind it. What we're doing is we're looking at these 4 adaptation innovations that are in accordance with the IPCC United Nations report to sea level rise. And we're saying that there are also many other ways that we can think of it, and they are nature-based solutions that are local technologies. And interestingly, these local technologies also can be thought of under these idea of adaptation pathways. And so this can shift our contemporary idea of how we're thinking about adaptation pathways and contemporary resilient design. So I'm going to go into examples of each of these different types of adaptation pathways approaches. So the first one they talk about, and probably the one that we are most accustomed to, is this idea of protect. And this is this strategy of fortifying against climate change. And this is a way of protecting coastal ecosystems by eliminating direct impacts or from natural hazards. And this protection that is provided to coastal ecosystems is sediment-based protection, but the most widely used protection strategies involve hard infrastructures and this idea of these universal approaches that are breakwaters and breakwalls and dikes and surge barriers. While in the short term, these solutions really are pretty cost effective in dense urban areas, these hard protection systems, they can be really expensive to maintain and to rebuild, and they can also lead to more flooding and more erosion and the destruction of other ecosystems down the line. So just to go back to the Dutch and go back historically to how the Dutch became these experts in dealing with sea level rise and responses to sea level rise and the technologies that we see sort of universally applied around the globe. So the Dutch was settled by the Frisians in 400 BC in these types of built environments like this. This is called a turpen, and it's actually like a mounded village. And these were forms of protection from flooding And they were accompanied by these really long dikes, which you can see sort of coming down this road and coming towards you in the picture. This is called a dike, which is like a raised embankment. And they were designed to hold back water and basically to reclaim land back from the North Sea. And this was evolved over 2,000 years. The problem now is with the Netherlands, this is called a polder dike system. And this is what happens behind these sort of forefront dikes, which hold back the sea, allows water to come in. But if, you know, sea levels keep rising and you keep on rising dikes, these polder dike systems that you see behind them, they actually become deeper and they become more expensive to maintain. And as you get higher dikes, you get these problems that, you know, prevent natural silting. They stop the deltas from growing. They stop the seas from advancing. Eventually, you get rivers running backwards. And then, you know, these whole areas will eventually be breached and inundated. So this type of technology really doesn't actually work that well in the long term. So what we're going to look at is different types of technologies that really work in different ways, but really still under this idea of fortification. And these are nature-based technologies. And I'm going to show you just an example of one here. So in this actual section, we're looking at the fish ponds in the Aiapua of Hawaii. And they show an example of how a soft system of nature-based protection has evolved in it as this idea of fortification, but it has a lot of different other sort of multiplier effects to the system. So this is an image this is a drawing actually of the system. So in Hawaii, the landscapes actually range from really high mountaintops down to the foreshore of the seas at this sort of land-sea interface. And at the land-sea interface, there are farms and fish ponds. And the Hawaiian people developed these are not really constructed anymore at the present time, but they developed a complex land division system that divided up the island into these watershed areas that were called Aiapua. And they were based on these really natural watershed boundaries. And each of these Aiapuas, they contained these resources for self-subsistence. At the very bottom area of the Aiapua, next to the sea, there were fish ponds, and they were thought to have originated in the 14th century. And they were mostly built about 400 to 600 years ago. And the fish ponds are both inland and in large expanses of shallow sea extending from the coasts of the islands. And so the fish pond typologies show how coastal infrastructure can be built with local ecology and, you know, with the local conditions of the watersheds. And so the construction of the walled ponds actually shows how local ecosystems can be used as building materials, such as using coralline algae to actually form the concrete that is between the rocks. So there's not actual mortar and joints like we would think of it, and concrete. There's algae that actually creates the system that holds all the rocks together to create a productive aquatic infrastructure. And then there's these additional benefits of creating these walled coastal areas. You can see on the right, that's an image of how big one of these walls would be. And that is the fish ponds. So these are primarily areas of fish ponds that are tidal fish ponds. But not only that, these walls actually reduce the impact of storms and storm surge, and they acted like these wave breaks and dikes. And they're both used as aquaculture systems, but for protection as well as for production. And so moving to this second category that is being discussed by the IPCC, it's accommodate. And the second strategy for sea level rise takes this approach to sea levels of letting water in. So allowing inundation to happen and learning to live with water. And really, the IPCC definition of accommodation is the redesign of physical and political infrastructure to allow for accommodating sea level rise and reducing vulnerability. And so in the following section, I wanted to take you into some different types of technologies that are really not part of what the IPCC is considering as a possible technology, but should be. And this is the idea of the Pumdis on Lake Manipuri, of the Manipuri on Lake Lotak in India. And these are shown as an adaptive technology that works similarly to the IPC strategy of accommodating water, but they're also buoyant and they employ aquatic vegetation as well. So this is just a scalar image showing where this lake actually is located in India, the size of the lake, and you can see on the right side this zoomed in view of the surface of the lake. So this lake is actually speckled with all of these circles that you can see, and it's India's largest freshwater lake, and there are thousands of these circles, and they're actually floating meadows. They're also known as pumdis or pushongs. And so this lake is about 9 kilometers wide and it's 11 kilometers in length. And almost 70% of the lake is taken up on its surface by these pumdis. And there are several thousand of these floating meadows, and they really exist only here. And the pumdis are used, you can see a closer view images of them. They're actually constructed as these artificial or floating islands. And they're topped by huts, and the local people create these as artificial circular enclosures out of multiple of the pumdis, which are the natural floating islands which they find. So they're gathering together these natural floating islands and constructing these huge circular rings, sometimes of a diameter of 100 meters. And they allow fishermen to actually catch an average of 1,500 tons of fish every year in the center of these circles. So these are actually fishing circles. If you go into what's underneath the water, there's actually a netting system that extends from the perimeter down to reaching the lake bed. And the fishermen actually use bamboo poles to stir the silt at the bottom of the lake to then reduce oxygen levels in the water, bringing the fish up to the surface to be then easily caught by the fishermen. It's kind of, if you imagine in your head an iceberg, this is really similar to what this might look like if you were to take a profile of what these pumdis would look like. 1/5 of the structure is actually above the surface of the lake, and the rest for 4/5 are below the surface of the lake. And they can be up to 8 feet thick. And there's a high concentration of vegetation that actually gives it buoyancy. And so the vegetation rotting is what actually creates this ability for the islands to float. Not only that, is they act as biofilters. So that means that they clean the water as well as creating habitat for the aquatic ecosystem. And so during the dry season, it also acts very differently, because in the dry season, the water is removed from the lake, and the level drops really low to expose almost the base of the lake. And these pumdis drop right down to the bottom surface of the lake. The roots actually engage with the lake bed. They absorb minerals and nutrients from the lake bed during these dry periods. And once the waters come back in the spring, they actually surface back up and rise back up. So they get that sort of regenerative cycle of nourishment that happens every year. And so due to their natural buoyancy, they're actually able to support populations during these water level changes. And it really shows how lakes and the sort of adaptability and different environmental seasonal conditions of lakes can support large aquaculture systems, even with water fluctuations, by enhancing biodiversity as well as food production. The third strategy is advance. And this is a strategy that really has sort of a really contested view and a complex history of working against ecosystems. And when you're talking about this IPCC report, it's relatively new addition to this understanding of responding to sea level rise. But it's now really important. It's coming to the forefront of how people are thinking of responding to climate change and sea level rise because of limitations of land scarcity and also population growth. And so this strategy refers to the expansion of land into water created by new land that is created using a process, what we call land reclamation. And that can be like by the building of dikes, which I showed you what a dike was. We were looking at that mounded village, the original mounded village of the Frisians. And so this often happens by the filling of wetlands and coastal ecosystems with sand or fill. And it happens in many coastal cities. And so one example is that in the history of the advance of China, about 50% of the coastal ecosystems have been lost, which leads to a range of impacts such as loss of biodiversity, decline of bird species, loss of fisheries, reduced water purification, and algal bloom. So there's all these really bad ecosystem impacts that often come from this idea of advancing. And this strategy really does have the potential to not only destroy ecosystems, but also, enhance some of the bad things like erosion and, the growth of coastal floodplains. But it can be implemented really considerably, and it can really assist ecosystems and habitats. And I'm going to show you 2 examples where that has actually happened. So those 2 examples are the Sungi Mulberry Dike and fish ponds that are found in a place called Huzhou in China, and also the Asi artificial islands of the Malaysian and the Lunga Lunga Lagoon on an island called Malaysia in the Solomon Islands. So rather than creating new land through filling ecosystems with foreign materials, these examples actually show you how materials and ecosystem services have been provided to ecosystems through this idea of advance rather than destroying them. And so in this particular system, you can see from left to right, it's a large lake again. And this is actually what the lake looks like when you zoom the lake, what it looks like when you zoom into it. And this is a technology which is composed of the planting of mulberry dike trees and sericulture, which is the rearing of silkworms for textiles, for silk. And it began in China over 5,000 years ago. And this is a mulberry dike and fish pond system. And it's 2,500 years old, and it integrates fish, livestock. It integrates these dikes and these fish ponds, which are called tanglu. And there are, several agricultural modes of production that are working in this incredibly symbiotic system. But not only is it an agricultural system, it actually is this incredibly huge storage for fresh water. It is a flood regulation system. It's a drought mitigation system as well. So it's stopping, sorry, I keep on using all these big words you might not be familiar with, but like it's stopping drought or protecting the communities from drought. And this is also a sustainable closed loop system. It incorporates renewable energy, water management, like nutrient cycling, food production, cropping, mulberry trees, silkworms, and fish cultivation. So it's like incredibly multiple diverse system and technology. And what happens, you can see here, this is, houses. These are roads that you can see. These are the dikes, and on these dikes, the mulberry trees are planted. And these are the fish ponds that you can see in the center here. And the mulberry trees are planted to provide food for the silkworms to eat. The silkworm feces then falls into the adjacent ponds to feed the fish, and the fish feces is used and the unconsumed sort of silkworm feces is used to fertilize the mulberry trees, which are planted on the edges here. So this closed loop recycled system of materials and resources that's all about sort of deep composition, and it's assisted by aquatic microorganisms, and it's this cycle of and closed loop cycle that moves over and repeats again. And here's an image of this particular system. And it really does maximize all the local resources, and it results in recycling all the waste and the energy. It replaces the need for any chemical fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides or any concrete flood barriers. And it also cuts the costs, and it creates zero emissions. And it's a great air purifier. Mulberry trees are amazing for purifying air. It also sequesters carbon um, more effectively than a lot of different other plants and trees. And so this idea of integrating and this technology of integrating these water and land resources is really an incredibly effective and resilient solution. It's a hybrid solution because it contains, you know, the fortification, but it also contains the accommodation that really we could look at to say, well, how is this type of system so different in its sort of multiplicity and hybrid nature than we're thinking about right now that can employ all these different types of other systems? This is an example that is a very different type of system, and it's in a different environment. It's in a saltwater environment. And this is actually a technology that is built by the saltwater people, and they live in this really long, you can see in the middle image, this very long and this narrow lagoon. It's called the Lunga Lunga Lagoon. And this community was originally refugees that were from the mainland of the Solomon Islands. And it's seen that these technologies, they're islands that are being built, which you can see on the right. They started being built about 15 generations ago, so about 300 years. And today there are 15 of the AIIS Islands, and they range in size. They're built from, you know, sometimes there's naturally occurring islands that are expanded, and sometimes completely artificial that are just begun from scratch. And they range in size from 1,000 square meters to 120,000 square meters. So really incredibly large artificial islands. And for the residents of this particular ecosystem, the high tides have actually become this really natural and welcoming phenomenon. And it's estimated there are about 12,000 people who live on these islands that are artificial in this lagoon. And it ranges from 10 to 15 families to just a single family living on one of the islands in a single house that's built on stilts. And there are different reasons that are talked about as to why this particular technology of building these islands, where it came from. One of them is to reduce the high epidemic of an incidence of malaria. The other is actually that this particular community, as I said, was you know, refugees, and they were running from enemies, and this was the form of protection. And what's really interesting at the ocean side of the lagoon, so if we just go back, you can see that there's an ocean side and there's a land side. And so on this side, which is the ocean side, that's where you get all the vegetation planted, the reefs and the mangroves, and there's this sort of, that's protecting from stronger waves. And on the other side, there's the, you know, shallow waters, and the islands are combined with the coral reefs and high biodiversity. And really, there's this sort of perfect kind of somewhat contained, calmer environment for the construction of these artificial islands. So very intentional in the siting of the islands within the lagoon. And so to talk about the construction process of the islands, which is really interesting, big log rafts are built, and they're floated out into the center of the lagoon, and then coral rocks are used to weight and to sink these rafts down to the bottom. So it's almost like these structured like modules of building blocks that are put together. Like if you imagine Lego is sort of like being put together and built to create these different islands. And after it's built above the high tide line, and once it's above the high tide line, then these sort of constructed rubble rafts that have been sunk are then filled in with coral rubble and soil to fill in all the gaps. And then different species of trees are planted on top of these islands. And the tree roots actually go into binding all of the rocks together. So they assist, you know, in shading, they assist in agriculture, but they also have this sort of concretizing netting system that keeps the islands construction in place. And as I said, sort of they're built above high tide, so they have this level of protection. They're planted on one side towards the ocean, which is another form of protection. And then the houses are actually built elevated above on stilts. And sometimes the houses are built elevated out from the actual area of the islands. And there are, you know, fishing nets, etc., that are underneath these areas that are just above ocean. So they're really taking really incredible advantage of different types of conditionings and understandings and form layers of protection against storm surge. And so to start to wrap up, this is the final, you know, adaptation strategy that is being discussed, and it's called retreat. And it's a strategy of managed withdrawal. And it's something that's being proposed here in New York by different scientists who are not the most popular scientists by far, especially in government. But this idea of managed retreat means moving in a different direction away from the sea and from away from shorelines. And, you know, it's a discussion that is mostly happening in circles of scientists and activists and academics who are really talking about getting people away from high levels of risk zones back to higher ground. And it doesn't really talk so much about physical infrastructure like I've discussed before, but more political and social realignments that have really a lot of upfront costs. And so retreat is a strategy that's used when every other different adaptation strategy fails, and a failure to protect coastal areas. And it's really talked about as this strategy for moving people away. But it also, you can talk about it as a migration. It can be voluntary or it can be involuntary removal of people from their lands. It can be displacement. It can be resettlement and relocation. So it takes all these varied forms of understanding. And so there is one community that I wanted to talk about in relationship to this particular idea of retreat. And that is the Biloxi Chitamacha Cochao. I hope I said that correctly. And they're located on the Isle of Jean Charles in southern Louisiana. And this is a way an Indigenous community has interacted with this final strategy of managed retreat. And so the history behind this particular island is that in the 1930s, Louisiana's coastal plain, you know, since 1930s, it's lost about 2,000 square miles, and that's approximately 98% of land. And it's lost it to the Gulf of Mexico. And this particular Isle de Jean Charles, it has the historical homeland of this community. It's also the most profound example that we see of vanishing coastlines. And you see this narrow island in the bay, and it has been plagued by this host of environmental problems that have led to this increasing flood risk. And what we see is this unprecedented, you can see on the left, soil subsidence that has led to this really, once it's very woody landscape, slowly disappear just into the sea. And it's made this particular community America's first climate refugees. And this has been exacerbated by the lack of soil renewal that's happened because of the construction of levees and dikes that separate the river from the rising sea. Exactly the example, which is the most dominant example of fortification and protection from sea level rise, is resulting, you see an example, in communities being displaced. It's also because of thousands of oil and gas canals that are dredged through the marshlands that have caused saltwater intrusion and extreme coastal erosion like we've never seen. And so this community has received federal funding for being removed for this idea of managed retreat out of this landscape 2 years ago, but they're still waiting for these new homes. But what's happening now is this relocation process is beginning. There's a dispute about what were the original terms of the relocation, of the negotiation that happened about relocation. And the biggest change in terms is that the community was promised that even though they were relocated, they would be allowed to manage the lands that had been their home and their territory for 200 years. But what the government is saying now is once you move from that land, you'll no longer be able to manage, nor will you be able to come back to these lands. That will become public land. And so they will no longer be able to access their ancestral lands. And so this is actually a fight that's happening now between this community and between this the government and this idea of this managed retreat. So I did mention that there was a fifth category, this idea of multi-ecosystem approach. So as sea level rise and climate change, there is an unprecedented adversary, one that is adaptive, responsive, and capable of these complex interactions along coastlines. And what it is that variations in all the local coastal conditions in the communities and the ecosystems, coupled with global weather patterns that don't directly affect every single place in the same way, it warrants that we really have to consider very unique approaches and amplify the strengths and counteract the weaknesses of systems that are in place and that already exist, rather than erasing them and putting in dikes and different hard infrastructures. And so by incorporating this mix of adaptive responses, which is not thinking just in these categories like defend, surrender, offend, and retreat, we can actually start to think very similarly when we start to look at nature-based technologies, that they all include a little bit of one of each of these things. So a system has defend, it has surrender, and it has offend contained within one system. It's not just individualized, and it is sort of a multi-dimensional approach, and it incorporates natural ecosystems like reefs and marshes and dunes, and it amplifies the benefits of those ecosystems. And so this, going back to a previous example, which I've already explained, that in the Lunga Lunga Lagoon, these are the AIIS Islands, and they have their multiple layers of protection. So there's a layer of protection in terms of siding in response to the reef drop-off and the shelf, the ocean shelf, to stop wave impact. There's a second layer of protection with mangroves that you can see here. There's a layer of protection and with building up. And then there's a layer of protection with trees, and then different strategies for stilting. And that's what is not really being considered when we're looking at nature-based technologies that are conventional approaches, is that there's multi-dimensional hybridized approaches, but we see these in nature-based solutions, which are local technologies. And what we see is that there's a relationship of symbiosis and working with environments, especially working with water. And contemporary coastal cities are, completely overwhelmed and overdeveloped in these intertidal zones. And what happens is there's just a destruction of all these protective systems that we see here, of foreshore wetlands, of mangrove ecosystems, and there's all the natural defensors are basically, being removed and reducing biodiversity. And so the idea is, can we take inspiration from these different kinds of approaches of multi-ecosystem approach, of building different types of these approaches into one system, into a way that we approach technology, and they become more holistic design approaches that amplify the social, that amplify the ecological and economic, agricultural, and the climate resilience of the environment and all of its inhabitants. And we see, climate change really needs these alternative directions as approaches towards how we're understanding responses to climate change. And so, for some communities, and maybe even for New York, where I am, perhaps managed retreat is going to be one of the necessities, the directions that we'll have to go. What we see from, what we see happening in Louisiana is that, there needs to be a forward-thinking understanding that's both political but also social understandings about how these scenarios unfold. And so, you know, we can't go backwards fixing all of the hard infrastructures and all the extractive activities that have exacerbated all the problems that might, you know, lead to this eventual condition of retreat. But we can go forward and we can keep rethinking and we can keep rebuilding in a way that supports resilience of communities and of ecosystems. And we can also, at the same time, address inequalities and the distance from nature that support our current systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was extraordinary. And so we have this few minutes to ask our audience if they have any questions. We've got a large audience today, and we'll use the chat room. And we've got a hand up from Susan Sterrett. Good morning, Susan. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Hello. Okay, we'll move on to Itamar Harriton.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Susan. I think Susan is.
Okay, Susan, are you ready?
Yes. Sorry, your talk was amazing, and as I was listening to it, I was thinking about someone I know at that tribe in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Thinking, you know, the mulberry thing, would that work? So I just wondered if you had any ideas or whether you're working with people from that tribe.
I'm not working with people from that community. I mean, I think that there's already conditions in place as to what's occurring. And I think more the point to highlight is that, you know, I've seen there's strategies for responding to disaster that we see across the world that is about this idea of managed retreat, but it always comes in place of the people giving up their rights to access land. And it happens, it's repeated everywhere. I've worked in Mozambique last year, and the same thing was occurring with local fishermen, that there was a need to retreat away from the coastline. But there are different ways that, you know, my thought is, well, as these areas start to, and maybe this does get to your question, as these areas start to be inundated, is there a way that floating technologies could be incorporated or thought about as possible strategies? But and that's what's happening in different parts of the world. I don't know if that would be at all applicable or considered by the community that's in Louisiana. But I know in Mozambique, what the fishermen are really talking about is, oh, why can't we set up different, and they use specific types of floating technologies very nearby, that this could be adapted to a coastal condition. And rather than saying, okay, that area is just inundated, let's erase it, let's get rid of it, let's get rid of its ecological value, let's put up dikes and like hard coastlines to try and protect the rest of the area. What are some other sort of intermediary methods that are accommodating or surrendering or allowing water in, but also allowing livelihoods? And can you work with seasonal conditions where maybe there are the ability to set up islands, and it's a seasonal relationship and a seasonal fisherman community that's allowed to go back to those locations while also not being removed. The other side of the question is, people are often moved hundreds of kilometers inland, and how do you move a fisherman from a fishing community to a completely different ecosystem? Like there's a lot of foresight and a lot of lack of foresight, in the political, that doesn't consider the social when making these decisions about climate change that really need to be addressed.
Yeah, so just one comment. So yeah, in Julie Maldonado's book about that tribe, she mentions how they would sometimes go fishing. They'd just stay there for maybe 2 months, and then they'd go to the house. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Itamar?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really incredible to see these different technologies, and the concept of low tech is a very inspiring concept for me. I wanted to ask if in your work and in organizing this list of different technologies, if the question of accrediting and giving credit to different communities who've developed these technologies over generations has come up. The question of taking technologies as inspiration for other societies, how that's if the process of how giving credit to the communities that created those technologies has come up, and if so, how do you because in the technology world, it's very privatized. There's intellectual property, patents, and things like that. And how do you deal with that while at the same time maintaining, acknowledging the fact that these are collective efforts over generations that don't conform to the private property model of intellectual property. And I also wanted to ask just a general question about about whether, because it seems like the technologies that you're talking about have been developed in the context of trying to find like what you call a symbiotic relationship with the non-human world, not about accumulation or showing yearly surplus. And I wonder whether you think that these technologies could be helpful in capitalist contexts that need to show the annual growth every year, or whether these technologies can only work in a degrowth or negative growth context where annual growth or rate of return for investors is not a factor.
Yeah, two really good questions. And yes, that question always gets asked, the first question. And there's, ways that can be, different ways that I'll respond to that question. So my work began because I was working with communities in place, in situ. So working with a very specific community and talking about their landscape and their needs and their wishes and their technologies, and saying exactly what I sort of promote in my own design practice and what I say needs to happen in the profession is to say, well, I'm not coming in as an expert. Let's look at I'm sort of an expert at understanding ecosystem relationships and how to design ecosystem relationships. And so what's already existing, and then how could we look at what already exists and look at expanding services or expanding the impact or multiplying the impact of those services. The question of, so my history is coming sort of from that view, and really talking to my community of designers is saying that we need to recognize that, that taking a Dutch technology into Mozambique or into Jakarta, in other places where there are already technologies in existence, and not ever recognizing the technologies that exist that are part of that culture, that are part of how to build within that culture, that's a failure of the community of designers in the built environment. And that's like that's like a very, neo-colonial approach to climate mitigation, which is, it's a very quickly emerging field in design that really needs to address before it keeps on expanding. It really sort of keeps on becoming the dominant mode of practice. And I think there's all different sort of views upon how different communities and sort of think about this idea of technology. I think the most important one that comes from the work is this idea of knowledge sharing. And so different communities around the world are really responding or trying to respond or being impacted by a lot of the same types of climate crises or environmental extremes. And these technologies are born of those types of conditions. So for example, pyrotechnology, the Fire Stick Alliance that you see, or the use of cultural burning in Australia. There's a community in Australia that is knowledge sharing about cultural burning, and there's on the ground workshops, but there's also very much a global knowledge sharing system that is still emerging. That this idea of sharing knowledge between different communities who are experiencing the same conditions, but also communities, say in you know, a very cold environments that are starting to see climate changes occurring that are asking, well, what do we do when we start going from, you know, an Arctic to tundra to a more temperate type of environment? What are we going to do in terms of practices of agriculture? Are there different technologies that can be shared with us that will start to help with this transitions that are happening from climate change? So I think it's more about knowledge sharing, and also how design is actually practiced in place within different communities in those interactions. The idea of symbiotic relationships and technologies in terms of like the capitalist context. I mean, there's two very different types of technologies. The way we sort of conceive of technology within the capitalist framework and green technologies is very different way that the nature-based technologies that I'm looking at were kind of evolved. And one technology was evolved with lots of money, an understanding of infinite resources, infinite political support, private and public-private partnerships, a whole different type of context. And then another technology is often like the other 95% of communities around the world that are dealing with climate change using finite number of resources, not with a lot of additional funding, and, you know, understanding that there has to be a feedback relationship with the environment. So I guess, you know, I don't think that we need to just only think of these technologies in a context of deglobalization. I think we're already moving towards a system of understanding that globalization is shifting towards what we, you know, it's talked about as multipolarity. And it's not saying we need to deglobalize, but we need to start becoming far more regional and understanding regionality as a condition upon which economic growth is really responding to. And I think, you know, a lot of the contemporary discussion about that is happening because of the pandemic and the failure of global trade, of global resources, of global migrations, of AI systems, of lots of different, you know, globally dependent, really fragile systems that are based upon capitalism that actually don't work when faced with crises. And so from the very sort of individual local technology scale, you can sort of think of these ideas all the way up to like what you're talking about, you know, the larger capitalist global economic scale, that we're seeing those failures really in a much sort of global scale, and people are already discussing the fact that we need to move away from that. And maybe that's going to happen at the same time as we start to rethink about the environmental movement taking on seriously the idea of nature-based technologies being probably one of the majorly effective ways to mitigate climate change as well. Oh, you're on mute, Jolene.
We have a question from chat from Riwa.
Hi, that was a really nice presentation. And I actually spent some time studying the East Kolkata wetlands in Calcutta. And since then, I'm really interested in indigenous technologies and its application to climate change. I was just wondering, while you were doing your research, what was your process in terms of discovering and identifying these case studies? Like, how did you go about knowing about them and discovering where they were? And also, did you come across any urban examples of technologies like these?
Yeah, I mean, the East Calcutta wetlands, I heard about before I ever went there. I actually taught a urban design studio in Calcutta. And that's where I got to meet Professor Ghosh, who was the person who's been championing the preservation of those wetlands for 50 years, who passed away last year. So it's kind of sometimes been through a process of working with a community, which has been through a project or through teaching, because I teach the Global Studio at Columbia, where we go to different communities and work to think about how, you know, urban design can deal with climate change. Or it's been just an interest that I have had in a particular technology and then talk to a different community. Or there's also, you know, more recently been different people coming from different communities to say, you know, look, have you looked at this technology here? And like, how can, you know, is there a way that the research I've already done into this that I didn't even know was like so much of a thing, can that be introduced? So there's kind of been a lot of different ways. It's not really a one size fits all way that the technologies have come into sort of like me knowing about them. Sorry, what was the second question?
If you came across any urban examples.
I mean, Kolkata is an urban example.
Yeah.
So the thing is, you know, a lot of, if you start to look historically, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, the islanding technologies used to be in Germany, used to be in Italy, in France, there's still some in Scotland, but this was a technology that starts to be displaced as urbanization occurs. So you don't often find these types of technologies in close proximity to urban environments. Calcutta is just an example, but it's a really new example. It's about 100, 120 years old. And so, but then you have migration happening and different communities migrating to different environments and then bringing technologies with them. So one of the examples that Jolene mentioned was the living root bridges in the Khasi and Meghalaya. That was actually a technology that was supposedly brought from Laos by a community that moved up and migrated into northern India to Meghalaya and brought this technology of the living bridges to that location about 1,000 years ago. So there's also migration of technologies. The Kanat system that I did not show, but it's in the book. It's a system that's an underground aqueduct for a really arid environment that takes water across really vast distances. That actually was a system that birthed the city of Tehran and has birthed cities all over the world because it's spread across the Middle East all the way through Africa. There's like 50 names for a Kanat in all different languages because it just migrated all the way to China. It's really interesting that it's not that it's incredibly apparent because what I talk about, it's not like it's a pyramid that is this monumental territorial occupation of a land. It's something that has a different physical manifestation, but there is relationships to cities. It's whether these technologies are still sort of the dominant model of technology. Like you find Indian step wells, but those Indian steps wells was displaced by colonial plumbing. So that's what begins to happen. And that's what you see sort of all over the world. So that's why there's not that many urban examples.
Yeah.
Great,
Thank
we're going. Tomas?
Hi, thank you so much for
Hi.
a presentation. So one question I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first being, these are really great adaptive technologies. However, they are also they also exist and were developed in a social context. So just as you mentioned, it's problematic for folks from the global north to be imposing certain technologies in the global south. We could run into troubles trying to borrow principles and practices from these other sorts of cultures that are more nature-based. So I'm wondering how we could get around that issue. And then also, with regards to climate change, we're seeing that a lot of these traditional adaptive systems are having their adaptive capacity tested. And I've worked in Chiapas with the Maya farmers who are cultivating milpa, which I believe you used in your book as one of the case studies. And we're seeing that, with the rainy season coming later, with the rains being just less available, less precipitation, farmers are starting to abandon traditional practices and move. We get into the issue of mobilization that you brought up. So, I guess the question is, do you believe that these traditional systems, which have adapted to a unique biological and environmental context, whether they will adapt to be capable of adapting to this new kind of set of environmental conditions that's happening faster than we've seen before, and particularly because a lot of these groups have been so politically, economically marginalized?
To take the first question, so the social context, yes, very specific social and cultural context in different locations with different technologies. Some not so much, and some are newer, some are much older, some are not used as much anymore, but we see traces of these technologies. Some have already migrated, like the Kanat system, across half the globe. And I think that this is a conversation that needs to be championed by the people who have developed the technologies, to say whether there is knowledge sharing that wants to happen, whether that's available to happen, and who that can happen with, and the terms and conditions upon which that happens. So that's a much broader conversation. I think much of what I'm talking about with low tech is to say, to not even consider that there are other technologies besides the technologies that we now talk about as green technologies and green solutions is completely false. And it's part of the whole colonial framework upon which we exist. And that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed in my profession. And it needs to be addressed far more broadly on that. And this is one of those ways, like if we're climate change is a colonial problem as well, and that needs to be addressed. And I think the work and the way the discussions that are sort of talked about in the book is that is happening in technology, and technology that's talking about the environmental movement. And so, we talk about climate change solutions, and there is so much money being put into climate change solutions, and half of that money is going now to 5 big conservation funds. And those 5 conservation funds have been the people that have been part of the whole cycle and framework of biodiversity destruction and genocide and Indigenous people being displaced from their lands. So they've been part of the problem, yet now they're sort of changing their messaging and saying, well, we're offering all the climate change solutions, so we'll grab all the money that comes from that. And so this idea of redefining what a climate change solution is, that it's not a pristine wetland or a pristine forest that's protected on sort of a Western legislative framework, that these are, in place technologies that communities have ownership of, that if they were to scale would need funding. Why isn't that funding going to climate change technologies and communities that, if these systems were scaled and sustainably amplified and communities were given support to be able to do that, that could have one of the greatest impacts upon climate change, far greater than, we know the failed method of conservation has had. We've already seen it, that it's failed. So there's like a lot of, it's a really complex discussion. It's incredibly complex and it's really diverse, and it's probably not for me to have that discussion at all. I can contribute to that discussion, but it's not for me to take the leadership in that discussion. But I just want to sort of highlight and recognize in my field what's occurring and what's happening, and the need to address that. And then how can we, sorry, what was the second question? How can we
just essentially
in the adaptation?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's being affected by climate change, and we don't know. That's the whole thing. It's unvaried. We don't have the models to be able to predict the effects. We're seeing the worst predictions occurring right now. And the one thing that I think about these technologies, as opposed to the solutions that we're sort of most commonly talking about, is these technologies were often born out of these fluctuated conditions of environmental crisis. So extreme wildfires, pyrotechnology is about the containment and understanding of how to culturally burn a landscape, how to use fire in a very intelligent, sophisticated way, to use it in times where it doesn't affect the reproductive cycle of plants or animals, to use it to enhance the growth of different ecosystems. It's a very, and it's preventative and it's predictive, and it has sort of all the understandings of what we call resilience, which is our greatest way of dealing with climate change, already embedded in the technologies. So I don't know specifically, and I can't speak to specific technologies because I'm not an expert on actual each individual technology. There is an abandonment, but there's also, you know, an understanding that there's a resurgence, and people saying that these technologies really do need to, if they have been abandoned, and often been abandoned because governments have put bans on using these types of technologies, which is another part of the colonial framework, that they're being considered as, you know, the efficacy of banning, the efficacy of universality of application of green technologies being questioned. And there's been Indigenous communities saying we need to take these technologies, and local communities saying we need to take these technologies back up. And there has been an uptake. And I know there is a shift towards scientists now looking at these technologies and starting to unpack all the misconceptions of them. Some of the misconceptions are that they increase desertification or increase drought, which is being now proven wrong, and really start to try and understand, like, well, how do technologies work in extraordinary complex environments and seasons, and take in all those conditions? And that's kind of, you know, I don't have a direct answer to tell you whether yes or no, but, you know, the exploration is like, it's happening, and I think it's incredibly vital.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you everybody for the questions. We have time for one more question from the audience today, and then I'd like to ask our students to hang on, and we'll make the transition to just some time for the students to meet with Julia separately. Okay, so we have Christina today.
Thank you for your talk. My question is maybe just trying to identify potential regions in the US where a watershed planning approach could be most successful given current realities. My examples were the state of New York, in addition to neighboring states, have actually been quite supportive of reconnecting watersheds. So specific to our regional problems of flooding, they're trying to both remove dams that are no longer used. So dams that were constructed 100 years ago or less in some cases. It's, as you know, once you've sort of built your landscape, given a certain hydrologic structure, there's a lot of complexity involved. So, once you remove dams, it affects people downstream from that dam. And there's a lot of legal, there's a lot of legal issues with who's responsible for any flooding as a result of a change in the current state. So I guess what I'm trying to say is basically, because we've decided to change our hydrology so much, and we've built subsequently, given that reality, there's a lot of complexity in how do we really move forward, especially in densely populated areas. There have been really successful big dam removals in like Washington State and California. There have been a number of dams removed in New York successfully. So, this is just one example. There are other watershed issues in addition to dam removal, but it seems like there's actually at the state and federal agency level interest in promoting ecosystem services, but I don't know what the connections are. There is also collaboration with nonprofits, like the Nature Conservancy has been a good integrator of agency issues and working with stakeholders. But in your experience, are there some really good paths forward towards building more trust in the community and integrating community knowledge with funding resources that may be coming in from federal or state level to enact change in the US?
I haven't specifically dealt with that scenario here, more in other countries, and sort of it's actually more the proposal for dams and looking at, well, how would that impact particular communities, and trying to investigate, the reasoning, or if a dam has been put in place, or predicting, like, what are the examples to changing particular watersheds, and how would that impact, and how could we deal with that differently? So I don't actually have like a specific response for you, but watershed management on a whole, that's related to different communities, I think that that's part of like, you know, comes back to a sort of the governance conversation, which is about like who is actually the person who is being included in the discussions about the watershed conservation, and our Indigenous communities and our Indigenous leaders actually being given a seat at the table to actually express their ideas and express their concerns, and therefore then express their ideas about solutions as well. And I don't think that's happening a lot of the time. It's definitely not happening in overseas where I've worked, and I can't speak to particular scenarios over here, but I think in the context of the work that I'm talking about, that's the most immediate way that you can start to deal with this idea of the dislocation of Indigenous communities from what's happening in those conversations.
Fantastic. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to answer these questions, Julia. And we'd like to thank everybody who joined us this afternoon. And we look forward next week to discussion about legal space and Indian country with Kane Smith. And we're also going to be hosting our presidential fellow in the final week of the speaker series. And so I'd like to thank our guests for signing on today. And if we could just keep our students who are interested in the discussion, we'll move to the second portion of this. So thank you. Take a moment, Julie. How are you doing?
I just came from a 2-hour talk that they messed up the time in Europe. So I was like,
you know, we all need these international clocks right now that we can really, because I mean, so I missed a talk by a day recently.
That's a big one.
It's a good thing I was a day early.
And you were a day early. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I was sitting there about to go into a meeting 2 weeks ago, and I had meetings back to back until this talk at 4 p.m. And suddenly my phone rings. I'm like, that's the Netherlands. And they're like, are you ready to go on in 5 minutes? And I was like, uh-oh. And they're like, sorry, we got the times wrong. And I was like, oh God, here we go.
I know.
And I was literally like, change. Okay, let's present.
Well, last night I had to tape a talk, and I said, listen, you know, I feel like, you know, this, you know, some things, really crazy things happen. And they said, everybody's being more forgiving right now with what, you know, the whole Zoom situation. So I hope that's true.
Yeah, I hope so as well.
Great. So it looks like we have our students with us this afternoon. Okay. So thank you for hanging in there. And so within the context of your presentation, Julie, which of course always just like opens new ways for me to understand your research project, but there are two questions that came out of this that I'm really curious about. And one is, in your education, what was that pivotal moment that you said, you know, the way in which these environmental discussions are happening need to be looked at differently, and I'm going to look at Indigenous space. And then the other is, could you share the 5 big conservation funds that have re-messaged? Because I mean, I just never thought about that, you know, and I just like, wow, that was a big one.
Yeah. So I first studied architecture, and in my second year of architecture school, we all did a compulsory seminar that was called Aboriginal Environments, and it was led by an anthropologist and an architect called Paul Memmott, and he set up the Aboriginal Environments Unit at the university in Brisbane where I studied, and I think that kind of really shifted my whole understanding of architecture. And I then went on to study landscape architecture because of that. But it really kind of, I think, you know, it was one of those moments that completely changed my idea of education and like a big pivotal career shift, because I was really not aware and I didn't understand. There's so much about like history of Australia and the history of Aboriginal country and technology and occupation and settlement patterns and everything that can be related back to this discussion and of Aboriginal environments. And it really kind of like like blew my mind at the time. And I started to get really interested in different, and I was always a bit of an environmentalist. I was one of those kids who sat there looking at the Exxon Valdez oil spill in, you know, I think it was, you know, the early 90s or late 80s. And I remember like being like 9 years old and watching this, and it was the biggest oil spill that happened all, you know, all the way up till the 2000s. And it was like really incredible. And it still has an incredible impact on the environment that happened. And I remember like just going, what? Oh my God, like this is so just being so deeply disturbed and not understanding like what was going on. But then going into architecture school and realizing, you know, there was another path that I could follow that really explored a really strong connection between the landscape, our built environment, and culture and community. And that was a very different perspective to the way that I saw the world being created around me. And I just became really interested in it then and just kept on exploring that idea, although I never came across a course like that again.
Yeah,
and I haven't yet.
I mean, that's extraordinary. And so,
Yeah.
did you want to share? Because I know you didn't want to, you know, and I understand you not wanting to be like that point person on taking on these.
No, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International. I can never remember the big five always. World Wildlife Fund, did I say them? I think it's sort of like, let me text you the other two or email you the other two. I'm very happy to share that. But these are and they have a very long history of this type of practice. And there's an incredible book called The Conservation Refugee by Mark Dowie. And he talks about conservation refugees, and he identifies these really large conservation funds. Almost, it's a machine that has to feed itself, and therefore it begins to be exploitative. And it's also born of really colonial frameworks. And that was all came out of like a displacement of Indigenous people from their landscapes, from their territories.
Yes.
And I think, you know, I've spoken to people from Conservation International and different organizations, and there's beginning to be a recognition about, you know, nature-based technologies. And obviously there's a recognition of you know, of Indigenous peoples being stewards of biodiversity when you talk on a global scale. But it still becomes this governance and political and economical conversation that outweighs, you know, what we really, you know, we think that the conservation is great, but in reality, when you scratch the surface, it's really, there's incredibly corrupt systems that are in place that need to be changed.
That doesn't surprise me at all. We do have some hands raised.
Yeah.
Let me just go down the line here. Waylon?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Hi.
I really like learning about the different structures that are out there and have existed for so long. And I'm recognizing that so many that you've demonstrated really take like a community of people to not only establish, but to maintain.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the populations associated with some of these structures, which take more work to, I mean, not necessarily maintain, but yeah, I mean, maintain or which are more self-standing, and which, what are the size of the populations that some of these structures support?
I'm just like filing through in my brain. You know, some of the aquaculture systems support populations of 1 million people. Some of the forest farming systems are, you know, that is a territory that you find at like the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. That's the Chaga system. It's a territory of adapted forest that's the size of the sort of the larger area of Los Angeles. So we're talking really big scales. You know, the system outside the city of Calcutta, it supports the wastewater treatment from half of the population. And so that's 7.5 million people. And that's a daily basis of cleaning the water from 7.5 million people. And then it supplies 20% of the city's fish and agriculture. And so you're sort of starting to see maybe some of the quantitative relationships between these systems. But then, you know, you get the Madan, who were the people who lived in the southern wetlands of Iraq, that lived on floating islands, that they were a community of people that lived in those locations for 6,500 years. They were displaced by Saddam Hussein. He drained the marshes. That was a population of 500,000 people. And now it's down to about 10,000 people because of that displacement. And there's been a slow revitalization of the ecosystems and of the community coming back to the wetlands, the original wetlands. But, you know, the Lunga Lunga Lagoon, those artificial islands, they're, you know, a scale of 1,200 square meters to 120,000 square meters. So a really big one that's actually a national park and a biodiversity conservation area. And that's 12,000 people living on those islands, those smaller artificial islands that are constructed. So there's a very sort of big range between, it's kind of one of the questions that I always get asked is about scale and the application at scale. And I think that there's like a two-sided response to that, which is like these ecosystems interventions are very responsive to like natural carrying capacity. And so there's a question of like, you know, what is the method by which this system can scale and expand before it becomes destructive within its ecosystem, before it begins to be completely extractive and doesn't have that reciprocal relationship anymore. And that's happening in some of these ecosystems, and that's acknowledged in a lot of the interviews. People talk about where they've flipped tipping points, and now it's become something that has gone from like creating biodiversity to destroying biodiversity. But then I think, you know, when we talk about scales of the cities, or, you know, when we're saying, can we apply these in cities? That's not really what I'm saying. I also think we need to question, like, you know, we're sitting in the middle of a pandemic where we haven't been able to see each other for 10 months. And do the cities, the way we scale them and the ecological carrying capacity of cities that which we inhabit now, are they working? They're not. And so like becoming more cognizant of what the ecological carrying capacity of environments are, and then designing with that in mind, something that we don't do, that we failed to do, and that we need to recognize needs to happen as well. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah. Samia?
Yes, thank you. So you spoke a bit about, you know, conservation or climate refugees, and I think following the trend that you also just spoke about, I'm wondering if you noticed or saw a connection between some of the indigenous technologies and like reimagining borders, specifically like in terms of borders based on ecological, environmental situations, or mountain ranges, sorry, or rivers or bodies of water, rather than political and capital borders.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
Like a lot of the systems, and I should have mentioned that in the watershed question that was asked before, but like the Ayapua system, that was one of the systems that I showed from Hawaii, that was actually a system that was created in watersheds. So it was really responsive to watershed conditions. So it's like the top of a mountain peak, on the top of another mountain peak in a valley condition where, you know, if a raindrop of water falls, it goes this way or this way, that watershed condition, that was like the boundary condition. In a lot of the terracing systems, you find the similar type of thing where when you're reforming vast vertical landscapes at massive scales, the way you reform them is based upon hydrology, and hydrology is based upon where a drop of water is going to fall. And so that's really about these more watershed topographical boundary conditions rather than political. And then the system of governance overlays that or works with that or is responding to those types of conditions rather than the other way around.
Caitlin?
Thanks for your time today and your talk. So I'm interested in learning more about the maintenance that goes along with some of these technologies and architectures. So like, for example, and the Langa Langa Lagoon, like how often does the coral rubble have to be replaced? Like in India, the floating meadows, like how often does the netting have to be replaced, and what is it replaced with? So yeah, if you could speak a little bit more about that, I'm interested in learning more.
I think the very, you know, I'm going to say a blanket statement, which I don't usually make a blanket statement because there's such a diversity of technologies, but there's constant maintenance. There's a continual processes, but constant maintenance is a process of all our city infrastructures and our city systems, as well as our current agricultural systems. It's a different form of maintenance and a different form of construction because it's done without much larger industrial tools or mechanized processes or, you know, data-driven processes, but still a continual cycle that's constantly occurring in the background of cities and communities. And so that's happening. But the difference is there's often within the maintenance and with the regime or the life cycle regime of a technology, it's promoting the maintenance of its original ecosystem. So a lot of the technologies of islands are filtering the water at the same time. The technologies of the aquaculture are you know, stopping flooding from happening at a larger scale for cities downstream. They're sequestering carbon. They're providing habitat as well. So I think, you know, the difference, while there's a maintenance in terms of our thinking of maintenance about like human application and energy being applied, there's a whole process of energetic relationships that are just naturally occurring that are feeding back into the system, which is not the way we think about, you know, infrastructures now. And so that's kind of, you know, you got to think of like indirect and direct. So we see that there's a lot of indirect ecosystem, I guess, relationships that are coming to bear on us. And that's why we see climate change, because we haven't seen all the direct consequences of all the processes that just extract and spew out. And we're starting to see all those now and recognize what that is. The relationships between these technologies, it's not an extractive and polluting. It's more of a closed loop system that has a reticulative relationship and a regenerative relationship within the ecosystem which exists. So there's an ongoing cycle of direct and indirect maintenance occurring continuously. So I think that's like a really big shift between, it's probably not the answer that you were looking for, but it's like kind of like the way where I would think of maintenance, that we have all these other benefits that are happening that we don't have to apply energy to.
Fantastic. Francis?
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I'm interested in kind of the perception of these communities' practices, like of their own practices. So I guess I'm interested in like, how do these communities that do these more like ecological systems, like do they view it as kind of radical compared to the more, I think you called them like fortification practices?
They don't classify. No, I haven't come across anyone who's classified them within like the IPC conventional classification systems, and nor should they be. Like, this is a recently imposed classification system that's emerging out of climate change. I think the problem is that that classification system doesn't accommodate or even look at these systems, and nor, you know, as like ways of understanding technologies or adaptation processes towards climate change. But I think that there's like two different things that happen often when I have it's hard to speak like blanketly to everything, and I don't want to speak blanketly, nor is it my place to talk for a person or a community to say, well, this is how they think of, this is their opinion of. But I would say that often for a government or a political system or a community of people outside of some of the people that are managing these and creating these technologies, they have a very different opinion and don't value the technologies as much, and that there's like a struggle, there's a contestation. So working in Calcutta and becoming very close with this Professor Ghosh, who was the champion of these wetlands, he was constantly fighting with the government to recognize the conservation value, to recognize the infrastructural value, and to stop this system from being displaced, because the government can't tax the people who live there in the informal settlements. They can only tax if the land is filled and houses are built upon it. And then that forms a tax base for the government. Even though there's free services worth $21 million of operating a wastewater treatment plant being offered by this community. And even though the people in that community don't get any money from the government for offering those services. So the other thing that I think happens, and I've seen this, is that when dealing with governments, when I'm going to a different city somewhere and the government is like recovering from a disaster, like a flood, to get money to assist in recovery efforts, there needs to be direct lines of value and cost. And those costs are related to different types of housing, water infrastructure, sanitation, and these systems don't fall under one of those things. They might fall under 7 of these things. And there might be one system to provide 7 of these things, but it's not going to be like, okay, the building of this system will then support the economics of the building industry or this different industry or this industry. And therefore there's like this displacement happening between like, well, we need money for this, but we want to create this nature-based technology. And like, they just don't compute right now. And so the governments are not interested in nature-based technologies because they're like, I can't get funding from Japan or Europe to do this type of technology, because they want me to do their technology, and they're going to send in a set of designers to create their technology. And that creates an economic relationship that keeps on funding the Dutch or the Japanese or whomever else. I'm now identifying particular people, which is not great, but to set up that cycle of foreign direct investment to keep a cycle of debt ongoing with a developing country and a developed nation for these services. So that's kind of what you kind of start to get these big cycles of non-recognition, of thinking what's the best technology, what actually works. But there's not often a longer term vision and thinking about what would actually be very beneficial for a community in terms of the long-term benefits of that community by the government or anyone coming in from the outside to assist with any types of climate mitigation efforts.
This is really an incredibly deep, deep project. Okay, we have one last question for you, and I know you've been talking nonstop for 4 hours. So unfortunately, Della, one of our stellar students in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, is very ill today, but she still mustered enough strength to be with us. And so she posed the question, what do you think are the most effective paths or acts of advocacy for the normalization and implementation of these methods, which is a nice follow-up, I think, to the point that you've brought us to understanding the complex issues, both politically as well as, you know, the physicality of maintaining these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, understanding that the climate change crisis is also the colonial crisis, and that they can't be separated and they can't be considered as separate things on a global scale. And that these processes are still in place, and there's still really large political frameworks that enable them that are not even identified as colonial processes that are disruptive. And I think, you know, that is an issue. I think that there needs to be, and I'm not the person to speak about this, but there needs to be a recognition of Indigenous scientists and designers and engineers that are put in, you know, put in positions of governance and put in positions of high expertise that are then, you know, that this, you know, I have a couple of people in the book who I interviewed who are really prominent experts from those particular communities that are talking, that are incredibly knowledgeable, that are saying that they want to share, and that they're very much dedicated their lives to these efforts. And so recognizing those people, and you know, that's part of, you know, the ongoing project as well that I'm working on is, you know, if I'm looking for co-authors, people come with technologies, but you have to co-author, or you have to author something, because these platforms need to become much broader, far more extensive, and become far more voices that are involved in these conversations. And I think, you know, that's kind of like one of the most important points, is that there are so many people who can be in this conversation that are not being recognized at this point, and that really needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, thank you for so many, you know, it's just been you know, I hope with each of these lectures, you know, my own personal ambition is to actually go beyond my own familiarity and learn new things. And you've really helped me this morning to really rethink why I'm so uncomfortable with the way in which the environment is framed, the absence of a critical indigeneity in connection to the discussion around the, you know, just how environment is sort of hemmed in is this sort of idea that's so disconnected from peoples who've had, you know, millennial long sustained observational practices in place.
Yeah.
And yet those voices are distinctly the voices that are being left out of this discussion. And so I just so appreciated it. Was so, we met last year through the Sites of Conscience organization. And I was like, you know, I was of course blown away at that moment, and I couldn't contain myself. In fact, I was so excited to hear your thoughts. And so today we just, you know, if you were with us, we would have provided a beautiful lunch, and students would have had time to have dinner with you or to host you in other ways. And so we're so sorry that, you know, you're not with us, but it would have been difficult to do the European talk and our talk on the same day. So I guess there's an advantage.
That's the advantage.
But this will be coming your way. It's a Mohawk basket, and it's made out of sweetgrass and black ash. And I thought it was an appropriate gift for you because, of course, you know, we're dealing with the demise of the black ash. And, you know, and then because of the way in which the Seaway has put in, the St. Lawrence Seaway was put in, it's really changed, you know, the tributary marshlands around Mohawk territory. And so there's actually a lot of projects now that are in place to continue to grow the sweetgrass, which is, you know, natural to a whole, to the Northeast, but, you know, it needs, you know, specific areas. So
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, everybody. This is, you know, really great to be able to be involved and to be invited to speak and to share a lot of my thoughts and a lot of the work of other people as well. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, guys.
Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
Jolene.
Take care. Okay.
Bye-bye.